in Connecticut. Opposite me is a very fine artist who I've just met and talked briefly to a couple of days ago. This is James Coe, who has come down from Massachusetts to join us today for this interview about his work.
New York, actually.
New York?
New York, just outside of Albany.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you for that correction. That's right. For some reason I had in my mind that you were a painter from Massachusetts. Well, you're welcome anyway. I'm an ex-New Yorker, so I forgive you. There's much to forgive. Jim, we were talking a couple of days ago about the things that inspired you to become a painter. Mm-hmm. And I'm going to want you to tell the story, but let's start with the whole interest in ornithology and your professor.
Well, that's really what got me started painting, was as a teenager finding I had an interest in birds, and just starting to notice birds in my yard, in the suburban yard where I grew up, and riding my bicycle around town, finding different marshy spots to look and find different birds. And it was my love of birds, and then wanting to draw them and create a little book about the birds that I found in town. That's what got me started.
How old were you?
About 14.
About 14,
yeah.
Right, right. And then you decided, as you told me, that you decided to go to university, college to study this subject.
That's right.
And then you ran into this professor.
Thought I was going to become a biologist, and
yeah.
pursued it, and did major in biology. But while I was there, I wanted to take some art classes. I had stopped doing my drawings of birds while I was in college. I thought it was kind of a nerdy thing, an odd and nerdy thing to do, and I didn't think it was a way to get dates. So I stopped drawing birds while I was in college, but wanted to learn more about art and drawing, and took some art classes, and met up with some very fine artists and very charismatic teachers who were much more charismatic than the biologists I was studying with, and much more engaging, and found that they drew me much closer to wanting to become an artist.
Really? So you want to take all this interest on birds and put it to painting?
Yes.
I've always thought about that because I have a similar interest in as much as aviation history. Mm-hmm. And I used to build models for museums, and then I found that I actually enjoyed painting the pictures instead of doing 3D, because I could place them in the environment. So it wasn't just about the bird or the aircraft, right, but it was about the things going on around it that just added so much more.
Well, for me, that's been a much more recent development, because for years, thinking I needed to have a way to earn a living painting birds, I went right into book illustration. Excellent. And then used my expertise to illustrate field guides for bird watchers. And it wasn't until I took a break from that and went back to landscape painting, which I had done in art school, mm-hmm, that I realized that I could bring them together.
Well, you're a terrific landscape painter. We're right at the beginning of setting up a new show, and we've just put up a few of Jim's paintings. And this wallet piece behind us is the largest piece we have in the show today, and we're going to show you a few more.
It's the largest piece I've ever painted, actually.
Is it really the largest
Yes,
piece you've done? Mm-hmm. That's great. So we're going to show a few of Jim's paintings and let him talk about the process. And I don't know, let's see, what else should we talk about in this particular segment? Any ideas?
We could talk about this large painting.
You mean this thing that is dominating the whole
right, as I said, it is the largest painting I've done, and it's actually a direction I'd like my work to go in, because it was a really wonderful experience doing this painting.
It is great to, you know, one of the problems of being a plein air painter is you're restricted to small canvases because of conditions of wind and stuff like that. And to take something out like this is very daring. And the time, exactly.
No, this was a studio painting. This was not a plein air painting.
Right.
And it was done from a series of I've painted this house, I think, 3 times in the field, 3 or 4 times.
So you're very familiar with it.
Very familiar with the location, and but I loved working large, because I found that when you were standing at the normal distance that you would be working on a painting at arm's length, you couldn't, your peripheral vision, you could no longer see the edges of the canvas. Right. You were suddenly immersed in the canvas in a way that you're not on a smaller scale.
So you became a part of the scene.
Exactly.
Yeah, I hope you did you paint it in the winter?
I did.
Did you leave the windows open to just enhance the entire reality?
No, I did not. I find it's very hard to paint out of season. that I paint winter scenes in winter and summer scenes in summer.
Yeah.
And occasionally you're forced for a deadline or something to work contrary to the season, and it's much harder to get your frame of mind back into the light and the color that you experience in the season.
Yes, you're absolutely right about that. Our light is so entirely different in the winter and throughout the seasons. Everything is changing every day. It's one of the things that you get from being a painter is you notice these subtleties that, you know, the yellow-green of trees when they begin to sprout, and then at the end when they're turning to these red-brown greens, and then everything in between is noticeable. This is upstate. This is in New York State, then? This is near where you are?
This is an actual location. It's about 15 miles from where I live. It's a spot I go to because my daughter has a friend who lives around the corner, and I pass this when I drop her off. This is in the hamlet of Medusa in southwest Albany County.
Beautiful. Beautiful. It's wonderful that we still have places like this. You know, it's the country is changing so rapidly that when you go out and you find a subject like this, you can't help but feel that you're recording it for posterity because you just don't know how much longer it'll be around.
We're lucky we still have some of these original unspoiled farmhouses in the area where I live.
Beautiful. Well,
what I loved about this and why I think I'm drawn to this house and why I keep going back to paint it again, and I'm sure I'll go back again. I drove by it last week and said to my daughter in the back seat, I'm coming back, I have to paint this again. There's something very iconic about this particular house, the way it sits there in the landscape with these trees and framed by the setting. I feel like it's become this iconic farmhouse to me, representative of all the wonderful farmhouses we have in the area.
Now, do you find for yourself the focal point to be between the yellow, cream yellow, and the red barn? So it's just to the left of center.
The house is very close to center in this canvas.
Yeah, but the weight of the picture carries you over here,
yes,
which is fine, so you're avoiding the problem of being a centrist.
No, I realize
works in government but doesn't work well in painting.
I realized as I designed this painting, because as I said, I worked from a small plein air canvas where the house was not quite so centrally located, and as I designed this, I realized. Because I work on a grid when I do a large painting. I realized that the house was centered, and I realized that it might be courting problems, but felt like that's just where it belonged.
Well, there's a little trick that I use for situations like that. I call it cheating. You just move the house. Just pick it up and move it over a few inches, and it works quite nicely. This is wonderful. Well, let's talk about some other paintings right now. And
okay. What's to say about this one?
Well, we're back, and you have just won an award in this picture?
Last fall, this painting won an award at the Bennington Center for the Arts in Bennington, Vermont.
Beautiful. It's a gorgeous painting. It's so loose, and it's so vivid, and I don't know, it's one of those things that has a beautiful sense of spontaneity, and you were saying that you like this subject so much that you've gone back to it.
Yes, well, it's a location that I'm very familiar with because it's quite close to where I live. It's one of the nicest farms in our town, a historic farm. And I painted there the previous week, just as I love it when the grass starts to green up in early spring before anything is leafed out. And I had trouble with the format of the size of the canvas that I worked on the previous week, and felt like it needed a larger canvas to do the motif justice. So I came back.
What was the original format? A 9 by 12?
It's a 12 by 16.
12 by 16.
Which is actually a very comfortable size for me for plein air, but I wanted to tackle something a little larger. So I brought this one out the following. This one is 15 by 22. Brought it out the following week and nearly completed it on site.
Absolutely marvelous.
It's actually a good story here. There's a very kindly woman who lives there in this farm. But she likes to be notified before I come out to paint on her land, and I hadn't called her. And she came out, and while I was working on this painting, she pulled up in her car and started yelling at me and telling me I didn't know it was you, I was going to come kick you off. But I see it's you, you can stay, you can finish. But she had so rattled me that I couldn't finish the painting, and actually had to go take it home and finish it in the studio. I couldn't work any longer that day because I realized how angry she was with me, and
what a pity.
And how I had not followed through on my commitment to her that I had made, that I would call before I showed up on her property to paint.
You know, I think this is really the exception, because I find that in places that we go to for the first time, we go up to ask permission, people are delighted because they obviously love their home, and the fact that you see that it's worthy of a painting is a great compliment. And this is a great compliment to this farm, to this area.
She was delighted with the painting, and when she heard that I had won an award with it, she was even more delighted.
Even more so, yes, it's been validated.
We have this agreement that I have to notify her before I show up, and I didn't call, and she was angry with me.
It's great. Just a little technical question. What's your favorite kind of brush?
I like working with a bristle filbert.
A filbert, yeah, I like that too. It's
and actually, I just recently discovered there's one company that's actually making filberts the way they used to make them, not in terms of quality, but more thickness.
Yeah.
And Winsor Newton now has a double thick filbert, which I love because it's halfway between a round and a filbert.
Oh, thank you, Jim. I'll have to look into it. But I used to have brushes like that.
Well, that's how they made them 30, 40 years ago.
Yes, that's about when I was painting with them. All right, thank you. Let's move on and talk about another painting. All right, well, we just have switched out paintings, and this one is still wet. So,
yes, it is.
Story behind this?
Worked on it up to about 4 hours ago.
Well, that explains why it's still wet.
Yes, it does. This was an on-location plein air painting I did not far from where I live, and I painted it in the summer of 2007. And it was painted on a really hot, humid, very hazy day. And I thought it was a successful painting, although it never quite felt finished to me. And it sat around, it had been out to a couple of galleries even. But it was always there in the corner of my eye in the studio thinking, someday I'm going to work on that. And I wanted to have it for this show here at the Gregory James, and didn't feel like it was good enough. It said what I wanted it to say. So I started working on it again, I guess several days ago. And it had its ups and its downs, but I think now I finally have finished with it. And the issue I've realized, and why I felt like I had to update the statement, was that I see the landscape differently. I'm seeing much more grays and subtlety and values that I didn't used to see when I'm out painting in plein air. And at the time, I think this accurately represented my perception of what was in front of me. But seeing it in the studio and realizing the kind of day I was trying to represent, I realized it didn't successfully make the statement I wanted it to say.
Well, I think you're absolutely on the right track. Good painting is about being subjective. Objectivity, we leave to Kodak. But what I really love about this painting is the sense of transition for the viewer, the journey which a viewer can take. And it is, for me, beginning on the lower right side with these vivid greens and then transitioning to almost lost lines in the distance on the far left of the painting. So you have this beautiful journey that the eye can take through one part that is near you and one part that is far away. And what else would you want out of a landscape but a sense of taking a walk without breaking a sweat,
well,
even on a very hot, humid day?
I'm glad you were able to travel into the painting. That's nice to know. The other struggle I think this painting really represents well is the struggle that landscape painters in the Northeast have in the summer months, and that's green.
Oh, absolutely.
And the green becomes so oppressive, and if you faithfully try to paint the greens that your eye perceives, you end up with a very green, an overwhelmingly green painting.
A neon, yes.
And here I really was trying to paint green without painting as much green as you might think you'd need. And so there are a lot of grays mixed in, a lot of violets in the shadows. Everything I could do to knock down the greens.
Well, the greens are ideal. I mean, it's a wonderful transition, and the problem with green is something that has been recognized by many painters, and surprisingly, right into the 20th century, the beginning of the 20th century, we had it drilled into us as children that there are three primaries, yellow, red, and blue. But they were still arguing this in the early 20th century, and there was one German theorist who said green is the fourth primary. And his argument was that it doesn't portray its source. When green is mixed from yellow and blue, it has neither the yellow nor the blue. It produces something independent, whereas violet shows red and blue, and orange shows red and yellow. So it's anyone going into a museum looking at landscapes will see how different artists have had to deal with the problem of green. And you're right, it is a very vivid color.
Well, that's actually was how I remember the moment when I saw the solution was I was visiting the Florence Griswold Museum down in Old Lyme, and I can't remember the artist whose work struck me, but it was a summer landscape, and I looked at it and I realized that the artist had created this whole illusion of a range of greens, and it was all done with ochres and browns. There was almost no green in that painting at all. And I realized that there was my solution, and I was looking at it.
All you have to do is suggest it, and the viewer fills in the rest.
Yes.
Beautiful, beautiful. This is one of my favorite times of year to paint. I actually love myself when I'm out there painting to be out in actually cold weather. Tell us about your experience.
Well, I love painting in the winter too, and actually following on our conversation that we had about the previous painting, you don't have to deal with the greens in the winter.
Yes, that's one of my favorite reasons.
And also. that is my favorite. I really enjoy the colors, and I find I have a much more successful, a higher success rate not having the green to deal with. Not being a particularly sharp colorist, I don't think. I find the tonality of the winter landscape much more to my liking.
Now this is a studio painting from an original sketch in the field. How big was the original sketch?
The field sketch was a 10 by 16.
10 by 16. And
this is the...
Finally we're getting into your love of birds in this painting.
Yes. And actually I think I explained to you earlier, this was the fourth in a series of 4 paintings, starting with the plein air sketch, which this was in the town park nearby, and heading into the painting over the crest of this little near hill, there were these wonderful cross-country ski tracks that caught the sunlight.
Right.
And that became the subject matter for my plein air sketch, and for then the first studio version, first studio enlargement of that. And indeed, this painting as well had the ski tracks in it through several incarnations as I worked on it. And when I placed the bird, I realized that the bird was serving this red-tailed hawk that's flying into the scene there. It was serving the same function that those ski tracks were serving, because they would kind of take you into the painting.
A narrative.
And I realized that the bird itself served that function just fine, and I was able to paint out the tracks, and it became a much more effective painting without them.
I agree with you. I think it was absolutely the right decision. You know, one of the things that I've noticed about your paintings at this time of year that is something that a lot of artists struggle with is bare trees. And so if you don't have green to deal with, you have stark naked trees. And I love the way you handle the suggestion of the finer limbs and twigs of branches. That in itself is an art form. The other thing that I notice, being much closer to this canvas than the camera is that you are painting, your primary is a raw linen. Do you put a rabbit skin glue on it or something like that? I can see bits of raw which is very
not always. I do just for expediency. I work with a commercially prepared oil primed linen as well, but I love working on canvases where I've started from scratch with raw linen and prepared it with rabbit skin glue as the sizing, and then an oil primer.
Well, one of the very nice effects is that, which is very subtle, and you have to be as close as we are to this painting to see it, and that is that when the paint skips over an area, the linen itself serves as distant shrubbery. You know, it's just an accident.
I love the texture of the linen coming through the paint. When you drag over a dry painting, I love that scumble effect.
And it also brings us back to one of our more effective tools, which is serendipity, the happy accident. It's just gorgeous.
But I think your comment about simplifying the bare trees and just suggesting that mass of branches, that's part of what we do as landscape painters. You know, we have photography, there's no reason to paint every detail when we're out there. We're always looking for a shorthand. And,
well, the shorthand is actually more powerful than the suggestion can be a lot more powerful. And it's also something that every artist has to find their own way of doing it, because it is taking something that's extremely detailed in reality and saying, how can I simplify this and make it work for myself?
Well, and each artist's solution of those problems becomes that artist's identifiable calligraphy of their brush mark.
Absolutely right, absolutely right.
And every artist has their own language of the touch and the brushwork.
This landscape here just brings me back to Willard Metcalf in my mind, because he had these wonderful, great fields that barely exist
love
anymore.
his painting, yes.
Yeah, and yes, this is equal to any Metcalf I've ever seen, and maybe superior to several others. It's a beautiful painting.
The thing that I worked on this painting on and off for about 2 years, because I couldn't get it to exactly where I wanted it. I set it aside during the summer months because I don't like to paint out of season, and then I'd bring it back out the following winter. And what I was struggling with so much was to try and create that illusion of the glare of the sunlight off the snow, because that's what I really wanted to capture in this.
Yeah.
And I found that I had to keep lightening the range of values in the painting, because I noticed when I was out in the snow and my eyes would tire of the glare, I would see everything kind of bleached out.
You ever go snowblind in painting?
Yes. not totally snowblind.
No.
But you come back in and you can't see for a while.
No, it's astonishing. The first time that happened to me, the snow went so blue when my eyes were covered. I never realized I was doing that. We're looking of this beautiful landscape that focuses on the bird, which is a huge interest for you. We talked about this a little bit at the beginning, but this is a beautiful way to introduce the paintings that we'll be seeing next. But let's talk about the bird in the landscape.
Well,
or your interest in birds.
As we talked about it when we started, I began painting because of my interest in birds, and went to school thinking I was going to become an ornithologist. And it wasn't until, indeed, although I didn't go to school to become a professional ornithologist, I spent the first half of my career illustrating field guides for bird watchers, and I wrote and illustrated a book for the Golden Books on birds. So I very much identify as a bird and wildlife artist, because those are my origins.
Well, as a wildlife artist, you have a different point of view and a different direction that you're going into, because you're not looking to be as tight as many of these painters are, and you're also interested in the bird within its environment, as very much demonstrated by this painting. So can you elaborate?
Yes, I am,
on that?
and as well, I'm interested in knowing when a viewer looks at this painting, I don't want them to look at it and think of it as a photographic representation of the bird or a piece of wildlife in nature. I want them to look at it and see immediately that this is a painting. This is oil painting.
Yeah, it's a work of fine art that just has a bird in it, among other things. Right.
And I think in all of these aspects, I'm running slightly counter to the mainstream approach to wildlife painting, because it is a separate genre that's very much, there's an active group of painters who are working in that genre. And I exhibit with them, and I'm involved with various organizations of wildlife painters. But my work stands apart from most of them because of my approach to trying to integrate the bird as a small element of the landscape as we perceive it when we're out bird watching. That's really the experience that I'm trying to recreate in these paintings, is that sense of almost that poetry of that moment of being in nature and seeing a hawk as it's coursing across these snow-covered fields. I want to recapture that moment and not necessarily focus in on the bird itself, but that moment of nature, and as we perceive it.
It is a fleeting moment that doesn't allow intense study.
That's right. So you're not going to see detail. You just want to get that hint of suggestion. Yeah,
I'm reminded that those Audubon paintings that everyone knows had a big price behind them, in that many birds were slaughtered.
That's right.
In order for Audubon to get that kind of...
There was no rush because the bird was strung up on supports when he was working on those.
Yes, much like many artists are strung up on supports of one kind or another. Well,
So and I've been doing more paintings of this representing this approach, where there's a large landscape with a very small bird worked into the landscape exactly as, because I have a background as a naturalist and ornithologist, I can work a very accurate small bird into the landscape and have it accurate in terms of how you would perceive it. The bird, the time of year, the plant life, everything is true to nature, and yet I'm trying to find, again, as we were saying, a shorthand way of expressing it. And so it's painting and not a photographic representation of nature.
Trying to avoid the dark side of the illustrative, the dogmatic approach.
That too.
Yes, go to the light, Jim. You're on the right side.
Having worked all those years as an illustrator in watercolor, where the amount of detail that you can get in there is almost infinite. I'm always running against that inclination.
Terrific. Let's continue this theme with another painting.
Okay. Yeah. This painting is similar to the previous one in that they both started, this one directly as a plein air painting. This is a location just maybe a mile from my house, and I took the canvas out, did the study of the creek and the reed and the brush growing on the edge of the creek, and found when I brought it back to the studio that the scene called for something more, that it didn't really have a focal point that I felt was successful. So I repainted it in the studio, working right over the plein air, and worked this little pair of mallards that are perched on the melting ice, worked the birds into the scene, and it became a much more effective painting as soon as those birds were there.
Oh, absolutely. I notice you do something I like to do too, and that is that I look for patterns. You know, I look for them all the time, but especially in winter, I just look for wonderful shapes that cut through a painting, and I could see how this could stand on its own without anything more, but certainly the birds and their reflections in the water have enhanced it.
Well, I think that's my inclination in all my work, and I think underlying my work there is this desire to find simple, abstract compositions and shapes. And I think the more effective, when I have an effective painting, a successful painting, it's usually because, and this is true of almost any painting by any artist, it's true because there's kind of an abstract architecture underneath it that holds it together.
Absolutely right.
And usually the simpler, the better.
Absolutely right. Trying to impress that upon novices about the idea of a painting looking good first as an abstract before it has detail.
Well, and it's so easy.
It's the whole foundation of a painting.
It's so easy to lose that, and especially when you're working out in the field and you're seduced by whatever you're looking at, it's very easy to not see that simple structure in the landscape.
I'm blown away by your dry brush techniques and the foliage in the foreground of how you managed to put that in and just beautifully represent it without it being overwhelming. Your eye acknowledges it but goes right past it to the birds. That is neat painting.
Thank you very much. This is a study for a painting that I'm still working on, actually, back in my studio. And represents, I think, kind of an ongoing working process for me. It's a series of paintings, and this is the only one of the series that's here. It started with a little plein air landscape that was successful, that I brought back to the studio and realized it was a little winter creek scene, and I realized it could be enlarged into a larger format, and it would be a great setting for a bird. And then I think, well, what bird is likely to be seen along this creek in the middle of the winter? And right away I thought, well, the great blue heron would be the right bird for this scene. And then I started painting a larger version in the studio and working the heron in, and realized I didn't have a handle on the heron itself. And so this was a study for myself, just a working study, to work out the plumage details and shape of the heron, which is then much reduced in the actual painting.
No, you can't tell from a TV screen, but I think the size of the sketch is, what, 8 by 10?
This is an 8 by 10, yes.
And what will be the intended size of the picture, the more developed picture?
The actual finished painting of, and as I said, there are two of them. There's one that's 14 by 16, in which the heron is tiny, only maybe 3/4 of an inch tall, and a larger version which is 24 by 26, and the heron is slightly larger than that. But still, even the finished heron is much smaller than it appears in this study. But this was an opportunity to work at a larger scale, work out the shapes, the plumage, and it was actually fun just to work on a bird portrait in oil, which I haven't done in a long time.
So how many great blue herons did you have to slaughter for this sketch?
So, as reference material for a study like this, I know the bird so well from my years as an illustrator, and I've spent 40 years now as a bird watcher, and such a common bird I know so well. But still, when I'm painting, I like to have photographic references to look at in addition to my memory and sketches that I have from my years illustrating. So I'll have an array of, say, 10 to 20 photographs pinned on a board and also on a computer monitor that's set up next to the easel. So I'm never copying from just one reference. I'm always looking at an array of references which give me the overall feeling of the bird.
Do you have about 3,000 copies of National Geographic at home?
Most of them have been chopped up and filed by species. But I have file cabinets full of, clip file cabinets full of bird images.
Don't we all have that?
Yes. Now, this little red fox study is unusual in a couple of ways. But first I'll talk about how it's not unusual. It actually follows very nicely after the great blue heron that we just looked at, because this is also a study done in tandem with a much larger painting in which this fox appears in the landscape. What's interesting, it's the same scene, same creek, same location as the painting that I'm working on with the great blue heron. And so, in effect, this fox could be standing right next to where the heron is standing in its separate painting. What's unusual about this is that it's my very first mammal painting. I'm known as a bird painter. I've loved birds since I was a kid, and I've always painted birds. But this is the first time where I felt compelled to put a fox into a painting rather than a bird. And it was just the nature of, I started with the landscape and started working out a large format painting of this creek in winter. And it felt, the scene called for a fox. I can't really explain it. It just felt like if I was out in nature and I saw that scene, that was the animal I'd be looking for in that setting, and that's what I wanted to put into it.
Well, like the bird, this is also an 8 by 10
Yes.
sketch, and will this be blown up to a larger size, or will it be incorporated into another painting?
The fox, I think, in the larger painting is painted at a slightly smaller scale than this, just the same as with the heron, although not quite as small.
So it's incorporated, a little bit smaller in a larger painting?
In a 24 by 36 canvas.
So has this given you the itch to perhaps paint other mammals on occasion?
Yes, absolutely.
Well, moving to the next mammal painting, this mammal looks strangely familiar to me, and it's obviously a self-portrait, and it seems like we all have to go through this as painters, and for myself, I've always been very reluctant in painting myself, but what motivated you? What was going through your mind when you decided to take brush and point it at an image in a mirror?
Well, this particular painting, I turned to paint myself on a day when I was distracted because my son hadn't been feeling well earlier in the day, and I was waiting to hear back from the doctor, and I was worried about him, and just found that I couldn't focus on the painting that had been on the easel, and wasn't sure what else to do with myself. So I just hadn't painted a self-portrait for about 25 years. Since art school. I had done some while I was in art school. And it was just a whim. I just pulled out the panel and the mirror and off I went.
Yeah, you appear to be backlit by a window.
Yes, I was, that's right. I was standing between the mirror and a bank of windows in my studio, and it was a dark day, so there wasn't a lot of sun coming in the window, and it was just kind of a gray day.
Were you getting another cross light or a bounce light?
No, I was working only with the natural light coming in behind me, right. Slightly silhouetted against the window, and the coolness of that light actually was what created some interesting colors and skin tones. And I was very pleased after not having painted a human head for 25 years to have been able to pull it off. I guess I do look in the mirror every morning when I'm shaving. So
whatever you did 25 years ago, it sank in.
apparently it did.
So it also proved to be a wonderful distraction to what was really a difficult time.
It was a great
day.
distraction for a difficult day, and also a reassurance, you know, being primarily a landscape and wildlife painter, realizing that the diversity of ability was still there, not having painted, and it created the desire in me to want to do more self-portraits, maybe even some figure painting, maybe portraits of my kids. I really want to mix it up a little more now too.
Yeah, great idea. It keeps you fresh. Lovely painting.
Thank you.
And it's always nice to go into an exhibition and have a sense of who the artist was. So these are kind of neat for the public. Jim, on this painting, this is a very vivid, striking painting. It's a very high-key palette, very chromatic. Talk to me a little bit about choices of the basic palette. And in this case, to those who don't know what we're talking about the actual colors that we use on the palette.
Right, well at this time, this was a plein air painting done in the field. It's 18 by 24, which really kind of the higher end in terms of size that's comfortable to work in the field. But I was working with a kind of expanded primary palette where I have two of each of the primary colors anchored with an earth. So I would have like a burnt sienna as my earth color, or transparent red oxide, which is a transparent version of burnt sienna essentially. And then for the primaries I'd have a cool yellow, such as a cadmium yellow, pale, and then a warm yellow, such as cadmium yellow deep, which is almost an orange.
Almost orange.
And then the same with the reds, a cadmium yellow light for my warm red, and a quinacridone red, or an alizarin type dark bluish red for my cool red. And then for the blues, you'd have an ultramarine for your warm blue, and one of the darkest colors that you're working with. And then cobalt would have been the other blue that I was working with this painting. And then I probably had Viridian as well as a green, just to help me mix some of those bright greens.
And in your whites, do you use one white or two whites?
I use one white, and I usually use a titanium zinc mix, a blend.
Now, by contrast, this represents a change of palette for you. You have not an entirely different group of colors to work from, but you have some different colors.
That's right. Really what it was the reintroduction of two colors that I had used many years ago and used frequently as an illustrator in watercolor, but had not used them in my oil paints since I started.
Let me guess. Payne's Gray?
Nope.
Oh,
no.
Okay. I'll just shut up then.
Naples yellow.
Right.
And yellow ochre, which is a very common paint, but I had dropped it because I realized when I was using the primary palette, I realized how easy it was to mix yellow ochre. And now that I've been using it again, I realize how versatile it is and how much I had missed it, and how happy I am to have it back on the palette. The Naples yellow, I'm finding, is very useful for toning down the greens and creating wonderfully sensitive grays. And nobody uses the original Naples yellow anymore, which is a lead antimony compound, because it's toxic.
It is available, and there's a genuine Naples yellow which looks almost like a cad yellow. We are so used to Naples yellow looking like a pale yellow ochre that to see an actual Naples yellow is quite striking.
Many companies sell a Naples yellow which is exactly a pale, just a washed out yellow ochre. What I'm using is a compound that's I can't remember the compound. It's a chrome titanate, I believe, and it's a pure pigment, and yet it has a color that's very similar to the original lead-based yet Naples yellow, and it has the same density that pigment had. And I've been very happy with it, but I love the way it allows me to mix some the grays, especially the range of sensitive grays that you can get with it.
Indeed, these grays are produced from color as opposed to black and white.
Yes.
And that's why they have a sense of life to them, because black and white are not actual colors, they are pigment, they're anachromatic. And that's often a fault that painters, I feel it's a fault, it certainly didn't bother Johnson or Sargent to use black, but or a few other people. But I always find that I too prefer to make my grays from color as you have, because you have such a wonderful sense of beauty and life in the shadow and the color of the clouds, the light of the clouds. Very nice.
Oh, thank you.
Right. Well, Jim, thank you so much for coming here today to the Gregory James Gallery in beautiful downtown New Milford, Connecticut, located on the western side of Connecticut. I'm sorry, you get a little bit carried away when you have to do something like this, but I genuinely, you are a terrific painter. I know you're a terrific painter because I'm a pretty good painter. And it takes a pretty good painter to recognize a really talented one. So Jim, it's been
Thank you
such
very much.
a
I enjoyed
real,
it.
have you really?
Yeah.
Well, we'll do it again. And I just want to thank you all for watching this, and hopefully you'll see more of this series. Thank you so much.